So, Amy, I'm sure you've seen the big story on the 2024 campaign trail right now is that a presidential candidate decided to go to a McDonald's and hand people food. This was, of course, was Donald Trump over the weekend. Amy, it got me wondering, have you ever worked in the food service industry or a job like that?
I worked at McDonald's.
You did work. You're one of the 1 in 8.
I worked at McDonald's in South Burlington, Vermont. I was 16, and I was like on the line making hamburgers.
Okay. Amy, can you show me a pay stub to prove that you actually worked there? Because
I knew that was coming. And of course I cannot.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment from the Washington Post. I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. It's Tuesday, October 22nd. And today I'm joined by my good friend Amy Gardner, who's a national political reporter covering voting on the Washington Post's Democracy team. Hey, Amy Gardner.
Hey, Aaron Blake.
Amy, so before we dive into the meat of our conversation, I wanted to briefly cover some campaign headlines coming out of this weekend and early this week, because we're getting into that last hectic stretch of the campaign, and there's a lot going on. So as we mentioned on Sunday, former President Donald Trump made and served French fries at a McDonald's in Bucks County outside of Philadelphia. The customers that he interacted with were actually pre-screened, and they took whatever he gave them while the cameras recorded all of it.
Never touches the human hand.
Very good, very
nice
good.
And full.
Thank you.
Good. Want to do another one?
Yeah.
I'll grab it.
First order, get 3 medium fries, and they're waiting for you.
Okay, very good. Let's go.
I think it's amazing how fascinated the country is by this McDonald's
It really
narrative.
is.
And if people want to know more, they should follow the excellent work of a couple of our colleagues, Isaac Arnsdorf and Marianne Levine, who are out on the trail like almost every day. And I rely on all the time to send me things that Trump is saying that, fit into the stories that I'm working on. And of course, Phil Bump, who does these terrific analyses like you do, Aaron. And I think he's written about the McDonald's thing pretty vividly.
Yes,
so
yes,
check it out.
I would encourage
podcast
people
listeners.
to check out all of that if you're very interested in the McDonald's story. Trump was also in North Carolina on Monday, touring areas impacted by Hurricane Helene.
The power of nature. Nothing you can do about it, but you got to get a little bit better crew in to do a better job than has been done by the White House.
Trump's visit also included him re-upping his false claims about FEMA money being diverted from hurricane relief to migrants who cross the southern border. And also on Monday, we saw Vice President Harris hit the road with Liz Cheney, the former high-ranking Republican congresswoman from Wyoming, who is now campaigning for Harris and warning in some pretty stark terms about what a second Trump presidency would mean.
If you look at where the Republican Party is today, there's been a really dangerous embrace of isolationism, a dangerous embrace of tyrants.
The two of them were visiting suburban areas in some key swing states in efforts to appeal to moderates and even some Republican voters. Amy, if I had told you 4 years ago that Liz Cheney would be out on the campaign trail campaigning for the Democrat in this election, how quickly would you have had me institutionalized?
I know, right? And Dick Cheney, my God, not campaigning, but endorsing.
Yeah.
But I think it's really interesting because, the Republicans, the pro-Trump Republicans are like trying to trot out all the things that Liz Cheney has said over the years, criticizing Democrats and Harris in particular. But the response from the Democrats is pretty good, which is, you don't get it. That's a feature, not a bug. They're
Right.
putting country over party.
She believes these things, but she still is supporting Harris because she believes Trump is just that dangerous.
Right.
Yeah. So, Amy, I think as all of that reinforces, we are very much in the final stretch of the campaign season. Those stunts and the events that are tailored to specific demographics, the candidates are really making a last-ditch effort to impress and woo voters. And that's especially important right now because of the thing we're going to be talking about today, which is that voters are already voting. And we've seen some eye-popping numbers come out of early voting and mail voting. And we wanted to put that into some context today. Amy, you've been reporting on all of this and watching these numbers very closely. Just as a starting point, can you talk about which of the key states are the ones where this matters a lot and that we should be watching?
Sure, happy to. Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin,
You're naming all of them.
Pennsylvania.
I see what you're doing there. You're just naming literally all of the swing states in this election.
I will say Pennsylvania doesn't have early in-person voting, but they have mail balloting, and so we're watching that. But really, all of them, I think Wisconsin only starts today, so we don't really have any good data, and only the Detroit area started in Michigan, so we don't really have good data there. But we've got great data in Georgia. We've got some good data from North Carolina and Nevada and Arizona.
And so can you tell me what you're seeing in those early numbers? Not in terms of who is voting, which we are going to get to, but just how many people are already voting. I think we've seen some pretty big numbers so far.
Oh, we have seen enormous numbers. It's actually really exciting. I get excited when people start voting, and I start looking at the numbers and looking at them again and looking at them again. So in Georgia, just to give you a little flavor, so amazing. 1,714,879 people have voted as of this morning, either early in person or by mail. And to put that in perspective, we are on day 8 of early voting right now in Georgia. It started last Tuesday. And the total vote of 2020, in person, mail, election day, all of it, was 5 million. So
Wow.
that's 34% of the total vote of 4 years ago has already been cast in Georgia. And that's, I mean, I haven't started my whole caveat thing that I want to get to in this podcast.
We're going to get to the caveats for sure.
I know. But before I caveat, I want to say that one I don't caveat. That's enthusiasm. Like, that's voter enthusiasm in Georgia. I'll say that much.
Yeah, and I think we've seen these numbers in Georgia especially, but we've seen them in a lot of other states. There's a website run by Michael McDonald of the University of Florida that tracks early and mail voting numbers across the country. And as of Tuesday, he counts nearly 18 million people having already cast ballots. That's 1 out of 9 total voters from the 2020 election. So lots of voters are already making their decisions and casting their ballots in this race.
Yep.
Now, Amy, you mentioned Georgia. That's actually one of the states that does not tell us how many members of each party are voting right now.
That's right.
And as we're getting into these numbers of how many Democrats and how many Republicans and independents are early voting, I want to emphasize that we are not going to do much handicapping at this point about what that means for the broader race. That is a very difficult exercise because we don't know who these people are voting for. Sometimes Republicans tend to vote earlier than Democrats do. Sometimes it's reversed. But there are things that we can reflect on in those totals. There is also a thought that voting early and by mail actually just cannibalizes votes that would come later in the process. So on Election Day, are these people who would just turn out anyways on Election Day? There are many things we don't know, and the comparisons that we make to the 2020 election are difficult because there was such an extension of mail voting during the pandemic. So all of those caveats aside, what do we know right now about who is doing the early voting?
I think those caveats are really important. And to your point, there is some cannibalization occurring where some of the burst that we're seeing is probably coming from votes we're not going to see on Election Day. However, I can say, I'd like to talk about North Carolina first, if I could.
Sure.
Way more Republicans as a proportion of the overall early vote are voting than did 4 years ago. And
Interesting.
I don't have the hard numbers broken down yet. I've asked for them today. So I don't know if there are fewer Democrats or just more Republicans so that changes the proportion. But they're basically even. Democrats are a little ahead. It's like 35% Democrat and maybe 32% Republican. Well, in 2020, it was like 40+% Democrat. So that's a big difference. And then in Georgia, while they don't do registration by party and so you can't see who is voting, they do have a nifty little map of the state that's shaded by turnout rate by county. Mm-hmm. And the darkest, I'm looking at it right now, the darkest counties are not in metro Atlanta. They're not Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett, or Cobb. They're these
more
little
heavily Democratic areas of the state.
Correct. They're these little counties that aren't as many votes, but that add up and that are very Republican. I've clicked on every single dark green county, and I'm pretty sure every single one went for Trump 60, 70, 80%. So what I take from these two states, and actually there's one more, Nevada, Republicans are outvoting Democrats early in person. That's also a shift from 2020. And what I take from those three states is that Trump and his allies particularly have succeeded in turning the messaging around on early voting. Because you recall in 2020, Trump railed against mail voting. He blamed fraud, non-existent, never proven, for millions of allegedly fraudulent ballots that allowed Joe Biden to steal the result. But he also railed against early in-person voting. And a lot of Republicans think that that messaging cost them control of the United States Senate. There were two runoff elections on January 5th, 2021 in Georgia.
Yeah, 2 months after Election Day. So these were races that happened shortly before January 6th.
The day before. And they lost. The Republican incumbents, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, lost. And one of the reasons they lost was that turnout was way down in the most conservative corners of the state, including the 14th congressional district, which is Marjorie Taylor Greene's district in Northwest Georgia. And it was pretty clear that there was a correlation between what Trump was telling people about the security of the elections and the turnout rates. So everybody got their heads together and said, we can't do this. We can't not encourage our voters to vote all of the ways. And I also want to interject a little bit of background about the science of campaigns here. And that is that having one day of voting leaves a lot to chance for campaigns.
Right.
There's the weather. There's the flu that I came down with. There's my kids got to get to swim practice and I forgot to vote this morning. That's one reason why you shouldn't leave it to chance on election day when there's less flexibility, whereas you have all these days to choose to go vote early. And then the other sort of campaign science of it is that when you bank votes early as a campaign, you sort of literally or figuratively, depending on how good your data is, strike that voter off your list of people that you need to spend money on to get them to vote and to get them to vote for you. So as the election day draws nearer, you want to be targeting your remaining resources on a smaller and smaller pool of voters, because that's a better economic use of your resources. And you do that by getting as many votes banked as early as you can in the process. So that's the sort of strategic value of getting votes in early for campaigns.
Amy, I'm glad that you brought up what Donald Trump has said in the past about early voting and mail-in voting and linking them to voter fraud and how that's created some problems for Republicans. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that after we take a quick break. So, Amy, you mentioned North Carolina being one of the states that we're watching here. And of course, there is a big variable that has been thrown into the process there, and that is specifically Hurricane Helene, which disproportionately hit Republican-leaning areas and has led to some questions about whether that could impact the race in North Carolina. Donald Trump was visiting Asheville on Monday to survey the damage from Helene, and while he was there, he praised his supporters for voting early. Let's take a listen.
The thing that amazes me most is areas such as this and others where it's so hard to vote. People have lost their homes. They've sometimes lost members of their family. They've set a record in voting? Can you believe it?
This is merely the latest in a long line of, let's say, Trump's varied commentary on mail and early voting. He'll often connect it to fraud, but then he'll tell his supporters to do it anyway. Let's hear some examples.
Right now we have this stupid stuff where you can vote 45 days early. I wonder what the hell happens during that 45.
Absentee voting, early voting, and election day voting are all good options. Republicans must make a plan, register, and vote.
We don't want them to do mail-in ballots because it's going to lead to total election fraud.
Go out and make a plan to vote early, vote absentee, or vote in person on election day, but you got to get out and vote.
I wanted to know what you think about these mixed messages and, why it seems that maybe Republicans have been able to get past the reservations that their voters had about these methods of voting.
I have two thoughts. First, those snippets where he's encouraging people to vote all the ways, you can tell he's reading from a teleprompter. He's got that monotonous teleprompter voice that he gets. Whereas when he really, really rails against fraud, he's ad-libbing. And that's kind of where his heart really lies, I think. So that's one, observation that I would make. The other thing that I would say is that when he's asked, why are you railing against mail voting, but also encouraging people to do it? He does answer that question with a, understandable answer, which is, look, it's the law, it's allowed, they're doing it. We need to not leave that money on the table, so to speak. And he still says, I want to get rid of mail voting, even as he encourages his voters to use it this year to stay competitive with the other side. I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I've always had some kind of conflicting thoughts about this. Like, on the one hand, he is linking these methods to voter fraud, but does that necessarily send the message to his supporters that their vote is not going to count if it's cast via these methods? Like, if you're a Trump supporter, you might have some belief that these methods could compromise your vote in some way. And so that would at least give you a little bit of pause. But especially with something like early voting, that's not something that he talks about as much as causing massive fraud in our elections. And so I wonder if that's something that more of a viable option for his supporters because they don't think it's necessarily going to, lead to their vote not being counted.
Well, I think that early voting before the pandemic was already on a trajectory of growth and popularity because we are a society, a culture, an economy that's based on doing the thing that we want to do when it's convenient or now. That's sort of in our DNA increasingly, and early voting kind of fits in with that.
Right. Amy, what are we seeing in the evidence so far in North Carolina and specifically in these areas that have been hit by the hurricane? Do we have any indication about whether the hurricane has impacted turnout or early voting or anything like that?
We actually have evidence that it's not. 7,000 people voted yesterday in Buncombe County, which is where Asheville is. Now, that may not be great news for Trump because Asheville is actually a little blue
It's the one blue dot in the western North Carolina region.
Maybe one of two or three little blue dots, but yeah. So that's interesting. But actually, if you look at all 25 counties that got the initial disaster declaration, I think that the number has grown, and I don't know what that new number is. But if you look at the 25, they all are pretty much on par with where they were 4 years ago. And that's according to Michael Bitzer, who is a political science professor at Catawba College. And he has a really great Twitter feed. I think it's called Bowtie Politics because he wears a bow tie. And I recommend it for people who want to geek out on North Carolina numbers. So that's kind of interesting. The other thing that happened that I think is worth mentioning and I found interesting is that the State Board of Elections in North Carolina immediately convened an emergency meeting after the storm had receded and got to work figuring out how bad the damage was to election offices, getting in touch with each election office in each of those 25 counties, and passing emergency rules that would make it easier for people to vote. And then they did something really, really smart because you may remember that in 2020, some of the emergency rules that election officials voted into place or imposed were considered illegal by Trump and his allies.
Yeah, it wasn't just fraud. It was also these changes that Democrats made in these states were illegal, was the claim that the Trump campaign and its allies were making.
Right. And so State Board of Elections went to the House Speaker and the Senate President Tim Moore and Phil Berger in the North Carolina legislature, very staunch pro-Trump Republicans, and said, you guys know this is a really conservative part of the state, right? We sure do. What are you doing about it? Well, we just passed these rules, but it would be really great for you guys to also codify these into statute so that we don't get the attacks that people got 4 years ago. And they did. And they did it unanimously. And then another beat that's super interesting is that there were still voices on the internet of people, pro-Trump people who believe that 2020 was stolen, saying stuff like, right after the state board passed these emergency rules, oh, here we go. Democrats are going to use Hurricane Helene to steal the election again. So it's a sign, to me, that's a really interesting data point because it's a sign that the messaging hasn't completely soaked through the base of, no, guys, it's okay. Early voting is okay. And making changes when it affects our voters is okay.
Yeah, and all of these caveats are so important, and I think that we need to remember all of them as we look at these numbers and as lots of people try and game out who is ahead and who's behind right now this early in the election. Are there any other caveats, as long as we're on the subject, Amy, that you think we should consider here?
There's a really good example out of Nevada, actually. I'm going to pick on somebody who is actually a terrific journalist and somebody I know, and he's a great guy, John Ralston, who is the lead political brain of Nevada politics. And he's been putting out numbers that appear to show that Democrats are in trouble with the early vote in Nevada. And he took the numbers that the Secretary of State's office had published, I think, last night, and it showed that the overall advantage for Democrats in Clark County, where Las Vegas is, and the by far largest place, the most important place to determine who wins presidential races and statewide races, there was only like an overall 4,000 vote lead there, which is not enough to offset the Republican leads in the much smaller other counties of the state. But it turned out that Clark County had not uploaded all of its mail votes yet. And so all of a sudden this morning, there was this new dump of numbers, and that firewall, what they call the Clark County firewall, had expanded to a much larger number that was sufficient. I mean, obviously it can still change again. I'm just saying this thing's going to go bounce, back, forth. And I'm not a big believer in telling people, oh, let's worry about this or let's worry about that, because we just don't know.
Yeah, and Nevada is, of course, a state that is overwhelmingly decided with early votes and mail voting. I think in the 2020 election, only 11% of voters actually cast ballots on Election Day. Of course, the pandemic caveat applies there, but the numbers that we see roll in Nevada over time tell you a lot more about who is ultimately going to be a part of the electorate than in other states. But as you mentioned, incomplete data comes in at different times, different kinds of data. It means that we can get kind of a skewed picture about where things stand at a given point. And that means we need to keep watching these numbers, which I am happy to do with you, Amy. But I want to thank you for joining us today and filling us in on what we know so far.
Thank you, Aaron. It's fun.
Amy Gardner is a national reporter covering voting on the Post's Democracy team. We're going to be hearing from our star bench of reporters like Amy a lot through Election Day. So if you don't already subscribe to the Campaign Moment podcast feed, make sure that you do that for great episodes like this one. Find us wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you want more original, deep analysis of campaign news in your inbox, subscribe to my newsletter, also called The Campaign Moment. You can find a link in our show notes and at postreports.com. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Sam Bair. It was edited by Allison Michaels and Mary Jo Murphy. We'll be back in your feed this Friday with our regularly scheduled roundtable. I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter. See you later this week.